So what happens to our love and our joy if we don't remember our salvation? We see something of that in an episode in Jesus' life in Luke chapter 7. He's invited to a feast by a Pharisee, one of the great and the good, religious leader of his day, and there are others present of that party too. And as Jesus and his disciples enter, they are quickly followed by a woman with a bad reputation, a reputation as a notorious sinner. And yet she comes in, and she comes bringing a jar of expensive perfume, and she breaks open that jar and pours it on Jesus' feet. She begins to wet his feet with her tears and dry his feet with her hair. And when the Pharisee who'd invited Jesus sees this, he thinks, how on earth could this man be someone from God? Because he ought to know straight away what kind of woman this is and not go anywhere near her. And so Jesus says, let me tell you a story, Simon. There are these two guys, and both of them owe money. Both of them owe more money than they can pay back. They both owe it to a moneylender. They've borrowed this money. One has borrowed £50,000 and one's borrowed £5,000, but neither of them can pay back what they owe. And so they go to the moneylender, and the moneylender, to their amazement, says, it's okay. Don't worry about it. I've wiped your debt away. I've wiped your slate clean. You are free to go. We are all square. Jesus turns to Simon, whose house it is, and he says, now which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. You have judged correctly, Jesus said. Then he turned towards the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman from the time I entered has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, as would be the Jewish custom, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little, loves little. We need to remember our salvation in order to experience true joy in knowing God's truest and deepest and most wonderful love. The message of the book of Esther has been unfolding before us over these last few weeks, and we've touched on it and circled around it and pointed to it in different ways. And we know that all of the Old Testament, because Jesus says so, points to Jesus, the salvation we find in him. And for those who have been turned from enemies into friends by his death on the cross, who have come to follow him, there is a verse in the New Testament which one writer has said very well sums up the whole message of the book of Esther. It is Romans 8 verse 28, and it says, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. The message of the book of Esther calls us to trust that in all things God works for the good of his people. And we see that in the last bits of the book of Esther itself. We see a summary being given, a summary of what's happened in the book, a very brief one, a very sketchy one. But nonetheless, it has something that points us back into the right direction of how we connect this into that verse in Romans. In chapter 9, verse 24, we're reminded that Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast the pur, that is the lot, for their ruin and destruction. That's why the festival is called Purim. That's why the Jewish festival today is called Purim. It reminds us of the lot. But of course the lot points us to the fact that even though Haman believed he was in charge, that he had risen to this great position of prominence, that he knew there were other forces at work, and so he cast the lot perhaps to see which way his gods wanted to go and what day his gods suggested that he could have his victory over all the Jews he so hated. And yet we see here in this reminder of these lots being cast, that actually there is someone greater and bigger than Haman, bigger even than King Xerxes, the king of the world in his day, someone who is at work and whose power is so great that it can lead the book of Esther to poke fun at times at this great empire. Another writer points out how through the whole course of the book of Esther, the king, this great king, the man who rules the known world, never once makes a decision on his own. He is always led to his decisions by other people. Isn't that ironic? Isn't that something that should make us laugh out loud when we realise it? Not once in the whole book. And Christopher Ash says that in the book of Esther, we learn to laugh at the proud but empty pretensions of the glittering world with its pride and impressiveness. And as we laugh, we fear it less, and our resistance to its seduction is stiffened, for it is hard to be seduced by an absurd fool. And so for us, what do we find? What do we feel when we look at the world around us? It looks powerful. It looks like we're so often being swept along in the tide. This year it's felt like we've been swept along in the tide of this virus. What can we do about it, this hidden enemy? It looks at other times like we're being swept along by governments and their decisions. We're in their hands, and they themselves perhaps are in the hands of figures in the media who have power to bring up and pull down. And yet, we as Christians, if we put our trust in Jesus, know that there is someone who's working on our behalf, who is always at work for the good of his people in every circumstance, and we can trust that. So what does it look like to avoid, on the one hand, fearing the world or following the world? Let's be clear that the world that we've been given is good. God has given us many good gifts. But what we're talking about when we say world here is the idea of the world in opposition to God, the system of thought and attitude that is opposed to God and his purposes, that says this might be your world. I know deep down it is, but I want nothing to do with you. What do we make when we're confronted with that world? Will we fear its power? Will we follow its seduction? Well, if we're tempted to fear its power, perhaps it's because of its power over us in physical terms. The power of an oppressive regime. We've seen the call in our series to pray for our brothers and sisters who are under the thumb of wicked regimes, imprisoned, sometimes killed for their faith. We want to pray that the book of Esther will be a comfort to them, and knowing that it points to Jesus who suffered and died for them, to give them the hope of eternal life and its certainty in his resurrection, and to point to the fact that he's at work in all things for the good of his people. But for us, well, the fear perhaps is not so much of physical torment or being removed from our families or in prison. No, it's about our reputations. Are we willing to risk our reputation, or do we fear the world too much in what it might say about us? Are we willing to step out, to speak for Christ, to share what we know of his goodness and his love, to say things that will sometimes be contrary to what our world says, but are needed and necessary? Will we be following the world? Will we be attracted by it? Will we be allured by its promise of advancement if we conform to its standards, or comfort as a result of going along with its priorities? Where are those points where you and I need to trust that the God who has called us to him is always at work for his people? Well, as we think about those things, let's discuss them and let's ask questions, and let's keep working through these ideas. But as we close, we're going to sing a song which brings us back to the God in whom we can fully trust, the God who has shown us how trustworthy he is, that he's not a blind force or random chance, but he's entered into our world in the person of Christ and borne our burdens for us to take us to his Father. Let's sing and let's rejoice together.